Finally, we are left with only one testing scenario which is not implemented yet. So now let's take a look at the function we're about to test. It's called calculateTrackedActivitySeconds. In this case, it takes two arguments, first of which is array of timeline item objects, and as the second argument this function takes object of activity type. So the arguments of this function are pretty similar to those we were passing to the function that we were testing in the previous lesson. So I'm gonna switch back to the test file and copy over this code from the previous test. Then I'm gonna paste this code into our new test. I'm gonna change a few things in here. For example, we're not gonna call getHours method on the date object to get the current hour. Instead, we'll basically use to, since for this test, this hour will not matter. Now let's call the function calculateTrackedActivitySeconds and pass necessary arguments. The first argument is array of timeline item objects, and the second one is an activity object. So let's pass timeline items array, as well as one of the activities. I'm going to pass training activity. And eventually this function is going to return only one value, which will be the sum of values of activity seconds fields. But only those fields that belong to timeline item objects that are related to the activity we have passed as the second argument. So since in this case we have passed training activity as the second argument, we're going to sum up value of this activity seconds property and the value of activity seconds property of the second object, since this object also belongs to the same activity. And we're going to ignore the third object, because the third one belongs to a different activity. So moving on to expectations, let's expect that tracked activity seconds number will be equal to another number, specifically to the sum of 3600 and 1800 seconds. So we are expecting that tracked activity seconds constant will store value of 5400 seconds. And just to make it clear, let's take one more look at the implementation of calculateTrackedActivitySeconds function. So after we have passed timeline items array into this function, it is going to filter down this array to contain only those timeline item objects that belong to a particular activity, in this case to that activity we have passed as the second argument into this function, and then it calls method map on the array of timeline item objects and extracts activity seconds property of every timeline item object, and eventually it is calling method reduce to sum up all the values of activity seconds properties. And eventually we're seeing that the test is passing. Now I'm going to rename this constant on tracked reading activity seconds, because I would like to call this function calculateTrackedActivitySeconds also for the second activity. So we're going to have the same colon here and the same assertion. Actually, let's rename the first constant on tracked training activity seconds instead of a reading. Here we're going to expect that the value stored inside tracked reading activity seconds equals to amount of seconds inside activity seconds property of the third timeline item object, because this is the only timeline item object which belongs to the reading activity. And yes, test is failing now, because I forgot to pass proper activity object as the second argument into second call of calculateTrackedActivitySeconds function, because here we're calculating activity seconds of a reading activity. And after doing this change, test is going to pass. To be sure we're testing proper behavior, I'm going to change implementation of this function. For example, let's use minus instead of a plus. In this case, we have gotten a negative value, which is not correct. So test is throwing an error. Let's revert this change. Get back to the testing file. Remove modifier only to check all tests in the project. All of them are green. So we are ready to move on to the next lesson. The link to the source code will be in the video description.